We're going to read today from the Gospel of Luke, and if you'll just listen to me as I share with you from Luke chapter 23, verses 33 through 43. And when they came to the place that is called the Skull, there they crucified him and the criminals, one on his right and one on his left. And Jesus said, "Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do." And they cast lots to divide his garments, and the people stood by watching, but the rulers scoffed at him, saying, "He saved others, let him save himself, if he is the Christ of God, his chosen one." The soldiers also mocked him, coming up and offering him sour wine and saying, "If you are the king of the Jews, save yourself." There was also an inscription over him, "This is the King of the Jews." One of the criminals who were hanged railed at him, saying, "Are you not the Christ? Save yourself and us." But the other rebuked him, saying, "Do you not fear God, since you were under the same sentence of condemnation? And we indeed justly, for we are receiving the due reward of our deeds. But this man has done nothing wrong." And he said, "Jesus, remember me when you come into your kingdom." And he said to him, "Truly I say to you, today you will be with me in paradise." This is the gospel of our Lord Jesus Christ. Thanks be to God. You may be seated. This morning, I want to start kind of unusually. I'm going to ask, Brian has got an image on the screen for us, and we are going to do an experiment together. If you can, are you with me on doing an experiment together? Okay. So, this image on the screen is representative of a famous psychology study that was performed at Swarthmore College in the 1950s. And so we are going to replicate this study today. Now, I was a psychology major in college, and I know I should have gotten your consent as you came in the room, but if you'll just forgive me, and you're willing to be my participants today, here's all that this study was about. Okay, participants came in and they looked at the image on the left and the image on the right, and all they had to do was to identify which of the bars on the right side image, A, B, or C, is the same length as the bar on the left side, okay? That's all the study is. So, we're going to have a little audience participation, and I promise this will be all I'll ask for. I won't have any, turn to your neighbor and tell them, I won't do any of that today. So I just want us to kind of figure out who in the audience, just raise your hand, thinks that line A is the same length as the image on the left side of the screen. Okay, no. Okay, we've got one line A taker. Okay, a couple. Okay. Do we have any line B takers? Okay, we've got it 1 or 2, 3 line B takers. Okay, what about line C? Okay, most of you choose line C. Okay, line C is the correct answer, but here's the deal. During the study, 75% of participants gave the wrong answer. So you all are way smarter than people at Swarthmore College in the 1950s. No, the deal is, here's what happened. Here's why only 25% of participants got this right. And it's because the participants were in a room very much like this, full of people. But what they didn't know was that every other person in the room was a plant. And every other person in the room answered before the participant, and they answered incorrectly. And when that happened, 75% of the time, the participants would give the same answer as everyone else in the room and also answer incorrectly. Okay? So the reason why I open with this is just kind of one way to talk about crowds, right? And what we're ultimately going to talk about today and find in Luke's gospel from Luke 23, there's so much we could do with this passage. This is one of the most beautiful passages of Scripture. There's the beautiful exchange at the end between Jesus and the second criminal. This is the moment where the passion is really coming to fulfillment. But what we're going to focus on today are the differing responses of the two criminals, the one on Jesus' right and the one on Jesus' left, and the differing responses that each of those criminals had to the crowd around Jesus. Okay? That's what we're going to focus on from Luke's gospel, from Luke 23. But as we do that, I want us to set the table with a few other characters from the New Testament narratives that also have responses that are born out of the energy of a crowd. And so let's just rehearse some of those and get some of those characters out in our minds so that together we can see what this broad narrative of the New Testament can begin to teach us about crowds. Herod, King Herod. King Herod had a banquet, and he had all of his friends and all of his dinner guests and all of his family at the banquet. But what had happened in King Herod's life is that King Herod had done something that was very controversial in the eyes of the Jewish leaders of the day. He had taken his brother Philip's wife, Herodias, as his own wife. And so many of the Jewish prophets and leaders, including John the Baptist, had said that this was wrong, that King Herod had committed a sin against God's law, that he had committed a sin against his family, that he'd done something wrong. And actually, King Herod was sympathetic to John the Baptist. He loved John the Baptist. He respected John the Baptist. But his new wife, Herodias, hated John the Baptist. And you can imagine why. And so King Herod has a banquet, and Herodias, his new wife's daughter, dances for King Herod at the banquet. And King Herod loved the way she danced. And so he said to her, he said, "You have given me such a pleasing offering that I will give you whatever you ask for, up to half of my kingdom." So Herodias' daughter got with her mother to decide, what is it that we're going to ask the king for? And her mother said, "Ask for the head of John the Baptist on a platter." And so Herodias' daughter came to King Herod, asked for the head of John the Baptist on a platter, and King Herod was grieved. He hadn't seen this coming. He hadn't expected that this is what would have been demanded. But what the gospel tells us, it says, but because of the oath that he had given in front of his dinner guests, he demanded for John the Baptist's head to be on a platter. Okay, let's fast forward in the story a little bit. We've got Peter on the night that Jesus has been betrayed, and Jesus is in chains in Caiaphas' house awaiting trial, and Peter is in the courtyard just kind of trying to be around to see what's going on, what's going to happen. And there's other people in the courtyard, and a couple servant girls come to Peter and they say, "Hey, we recognize you. We know who you are. You're one of those Jesus people." And the people around, yeah. Are you one of the Jesus people? And Peter, being able to see that the crowd is turned against Jesus and his followers, what does he say? He says, No, I'm not one of them. I don't even know the man. Peter, one of Jesus's main guys, one of the guys that shows up in a lot of important New Testament gospel scenes with Jesus at the Transfiguration in Caesarea Philippi, where he and Jesus have this interesting dialogue about Jesus building his church upon the rock. Peter, no, I don't know the guy. And then our third story is marching a little bit further in the New Testament narrative to Pilate. Remember Pilate. Pilate's the Roman official that is going to try Jesus and charge him. And so the Gospels tell us that Pilate knew what was going on. Pilate knew that it was only out of envy that the Jewish leaders had turned Jesus over to him for trial and execution. And in fact, Pilate's wife, the Gospels tell us, had even had a dream where she, in her dream, had been warned to tell her husband not to have anything to do with this man. And so she goes and she tells her husband, don't have anything to do with this man. I've been deeply troubled in a dream. Pilate knows what's going on, but he turns to the crowd, and the crowd demands for Jesus to be crucified. And Pilate says, his blood's not on my hands, it's on yours, but we'll do what you want. I'll give you what you're asking for. And so now finally, back to Luke 23. We've got this environment that's turned against Jesus. And Luke uses words like, the people stood by and the soldiers scoffed and the rulers mocked, and the first criminal on one of Jesus's sides begins to rail against Jesus, just like the crowd, and begins to mirror the same things we've just been hearing from all sorts of people. If you really are the Christ, save yourself. If you're really who you say you are, you can call God down from heaven and save yourself and save us. But the second criminal comes in with a very simple and a very straightforward and a very important question to the first criminal. And he says, do you not fear God? Do you not fear God? Look at you. You're about to die. You're under the same condemnation as this man. But for you, it's just. For him, it's unjust. Here you are about to die, and still, you're just parroting the narrative of the crowd. Do you not fear God? And it seems like that we can imagine that second criminal asking the same question to King Herod at his birthday banquet. I know you've got all these dinner guests. I know you've made an oath. But now when you've been asked to do something that you know is wrong and grieves God, you're going to choose them over God? Do you not fear God? And can you imagine the second criminal asking the same question to Peter? Peter, you've been one of the main guys of Jesus. And here he is in the moment of truth, in the moment of need. And you're just going to say you don't even know him? Do you not fear God? And can we not imagine the second criminal to Pilate saying, you have the power now to do something that's right. And yes, the crowd is turned against Jesus, but you know from all these different ways, from your own experience, from the testimony of your wife, what the right thing to do is. Do you not fear God? This is a question we have to wrestle with. And what I want us to talk about today is 4 things. And it's really just 4 ways of saying the same thing, but 4 things that we can learn from these 2 different responses that each criminal has to the crowd around Jesus. And the first thing is this: the New Testament bears witness to the fact that the crowd is nearly always wrong. I mean, this is troubling. We just have to kind of let this be. We have to let the Gospels say what the Gospels say. And the Gospels paint a picture in which the crowd is nearly always wrong. And I've been thinking about this week and thinking, okay, well, what about all the people on the pews that are now thinking about all the instances? So like, the main thing I could think of is, okay, well, the Palm Sunday crowd. Doesn't that seem like the notable exception? Except no. Even they didn't get it. Sure, the Palm Sunday crowd honored Jesus, but they got it wrong. They were the same people a week later that were in Pilate's hall yelling, "Crucify him." They thought that they were coronating a king or an emperor coming to town, and finally the whole narrative was going to flip. They didn't understand what Jesus was there to do. The crowd in the Gospels nearly always gets it wrong. And something that we have to pay attention to with that is the crowd very often looks like God's team, okay? And we just have to pay attention to this for a minute. Think about the instance of the woman caught in the act of adultery. That gospel story. We like to sort of caricature that story, and we kind of have this, there's all the characters on the flannel graph. There's the angry mob that's mean and bad, and there's the poor woman, and then there's Jesus who comes to save the day. But actually, the crowd in that story was doing what was right. They were doing what God's law demanded. They were doing what Moses had taught them that God had said they ought to do. And we can even imagine that many of them may have been grieved at what they felt was their responsibility to do. And they may have loved the woman. And then Jesus enters the scene and says, "I have some information that you don't have. I've got a new way to look at this law that you thought you understood." And the whole narrative changes. And we see only in hindsight that the crowd got it wrong. We see that again with the disciples. There's this beautiful scene where Mary comes, and out of love for Jesus, she pours open this expensive bottle of perfume, and she pours it on his feet, and she rubs it in his feet, and she lets down her hair, and she wipes the perfume off of his feet with her hair. And the disciples, God's main guys, they say, "Jesus, you need to rebuke her for this. This is excess. Look, we could have used this money from this expensive perfume to serve the poor, and look at the ways in which she has just wasted it. She doesn't even care about the things you care about." And Jesus says, "No. Wherever my story is told, so will this woman's story be told." The crowd didn't get it. The second way to say this is to say that being in step with the crowd nearly always puts us out of step with Jesus. And we have to wrestle with this. We have to wrestle with this in a deeper way than that. This is not just your 13-year-old sermon of, not doing, if your friend was going to jump off a cliff, would you jump off a cliff? We have to really wrestle with, because we see in the New Testament, even God's team can become a crowd. Even God's team can get it wrong. Being in step with the crowd nearly always puts us out of step with Jesus. And the third way to say this same thing is the people who find Jesus, in spite of the crowd, find the true gold. Returning to Luke 23, the second criminal took a totally different posture than what the tone and the whim and the message of the crowd was. And he turned in tenderness to Jesus and he said, "Jesus, will you remember me before your Father?" And he found the true gold. Jesus said, "Yes, truly, today you will be with me in paradise." Mary, whose story we just remembered, who poured the perfume on Jesus' feet and wiped his feet with her hair. Mary found the true gold of intimacy and love and union with Jesus, to where Jesus said her story was going to be told. She's done a good thing. The people who find their way to Jesus in spite of the crowd find the true gold. And the fourth way of saying the same thing is that being out of step or being in step with the crowd reveals who we fear and most want to please. This is what the second criminal was teaching us in his question to the first criminal of, do you not fear God? You're hanging on a cross about to die, and yet you feel some responsibility to be in step with this whole maddening crowd around? Who do you fear? Do you fear God or do you fear the crowd? And we have to wrestle with this question. I mean, if we're honest, if I'm honest, we all know that so many times, most of the time, nearly all of the time, don't we fear the people around us more than we fear God? Aren't we more interested in honoring and pleasing the people around us than we are in honoring and pleasing God? The Gospels are tough on that. The Gospels are tough on the crowd. Whatever the crowd is, even when the crowd looks like God's team following God's law, the Gospels say, whoa, 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 be careful. Be careful. You can hear Paul in 1 Corinthians 13 saying, right now you only know partial things, but one day you'll know complete things. Right now you see through a glass darkly, but then you'll see as face to face. And through that, we have to provide for the mystery of knowing that we don't have all the information. The crowd is not always going to get it right. In fact, the crowd many times gets it wrong. And we have to look for Jesus to show up. We have to look to Jesus like the second criminal and see what Jesus says. See what Jesus does. See how Jesus responded. See what Jesus has to say. Honor and please and serve Jesus, not the crowd. And the final thing that I'm just arrested with as we kind of look at this story together is, isn't it notable that this is what I love about the Gospels. The Gospels give us anti-heroes. They say all the heroes of the day in this patriarchal Jewish culture, all the heroes that culture would lift up and say are the ones that are more than. The gospel gives us, fishermen and just sick people and all, people that are just on the fringes. And what I love in this as I've just been going through looking at, how people respond to crowds is noticing, who are the people that got it right? It wasn't the Roman ruler. It wasn't King Herod. It wasn't even the person Peter who would one day really be such a significant guy in the whole history of the church. It's the criminal. It's Mary. We have to let the Gospels teach us that they over and over in 100 different ways tell us that there's something we've got to learn, and the only way we can learn it is if we become like those just at the fringes of society. Those who everybody else thinks are less than, those are the people who the gospel lifts up. It's not the crowd, it's not the mob, it's not the ones with the power. It's all the opposite of that. And that's mysterious because we are so often the crowd and the ones in power and the ones in privilege and the ones in affluence. And we just have to wrestle with what the Gospels say they say to us when we find ourselves in places of influence and power and prestige. They say, be very careful. Be very careful. Follow Jesus. Look to Jesus. Don't be too comforted by what you think is influence and security and stability and prestige. Look to Jesus and recognize that the crowd, whatever the crowd is very often wrong, doesn't often see full things, and the true gold comes when we find ourselves in step with Jesus, which often means being out of step with the crowd. And we just have to wrestle with that and let the Gospels be sort of mysterious and hard. I mean, that's hard to know what to do with all of that. But I think that's what we begin to see in Luke 23 in the different responses of the two criminals. Let's pray. Father, the Gospels are hard for us. Sometimes they're hard for us to understand. Always they're hard for us to live. Help us to see the ways in which we too often get lost in a crowd mentality, even in the church. Help us to find our gaze and our intention and our heart back on you, Jesus, as our source of truth and as our source of hope. Help us to find, like the second criminal found, the narrow path that leads home and leads to life. And help us to be like the one to whom you could say, truly I tell you, today you will be with me in paradise.